So we've got Professor Koos Malan back with us. Prof, thanks so much for swapping devices. Let's hope we have a clearer line to you. Before the picture froze, I was asking you just to give us a definition of what a national state of disaster is and how does it differ from a state of emergency?
In the first place, a state of emergency is a much more wide-ranging measure that can be taken, which requires the approval of Parliament. That's for the sake of time, I think we can leave it there. In contrast to a state of disaster, which makes provision for situations of disaster caused by any natural conditions, any natural crises, such as a big fire, such as a huge water problem, and something of that kind. Or a state of disaster can also be occasioned by human factors, which then leads to the minister responsible for administration of the Disaster Management Act, which is the Minister of Provincial Affairs and of Provincial and Traditional Affairs, to pronounce a state of disaster for a period of up to 3 months. It can also be prolonged afterwards for periods of a month, which was the same as we've seen with the state of disaster situation during COVID. Now, what that basically entails is that it allows government to take critical action, specifically focusing upon the procurement of resources in order to try to deal on an expedition basis with the crisis at hand. Now, in this particular case, we are dealing with a state of disaster which is said to have been caused by the electrical issue, by the Eskom issue. Obviously, it is disastrous on a very broad scale, as a result of which many economic activities are severely disturbed as a result of that. Things such as medical services cannot properly take place. One can go into the details of that, but I think it speaks for itself that this is in fact a major disaster which is actually to a certain extent bringing down government. In this particular case, we're actually bringing down the state, I mean. In this particular case, we're dealing with a man-made disaster, and specifically a government-made disaster. The very first indications that we were faced by an emerging electrical problem went back to 1998, when government was warned to make investment into the electrical sector, into Eskom, which it failed to do. Then in 2007, we were first confronted with blackouts, which simply got more serious and more serious. And in spite of the fact that all that was taking place, government simply appears to be completely incapable of doing anything about the problem, even though it received even though the issue seems to have received attention at the highest level, amongst others also by the president. Up to now, nothing basically has been done about it, and as a result of that, we are sitting with this crisis.
So here's my question. The fact that it is a man-made crisis, the result of bad political and management decisions, corruption within Eskom, years of neglect of critical infrastructure, does that affect the definition of a disaster? Because we have to meet that definition of a disaster. The reality is the impact is still disastrous, because one of the issues raised is that there was concern that the definition might not be reached, which is apparently why the president didn't want to go that route 6 months ago. Does it matter that it's man-made? It's still a disaster. Would it meet the legal requirement, in your view?
In my view, it won't. It is specifically mentioned in the Act that a state of disaster can be caused by natural causes, or it can be man-made. So strictly speaking, although it was clearly the fault of government, protracted over a period of 15, 16 years, still that would be falling within the definition of a disaster. However, that is not to say that announcing a state of disaster would not be challenged. I think it will be. Because strictly speaking, one would also have to take into account whether the situation that is prevalent at the moment, whether that calls for the kind of extraordinary measures, measures outside the normal course of the law. Government basically has to prove that the normal measures available, provided for in legislation and so on, that those measures are inadequate, and as a result of that, there is a dire need to actually pronounce such a state of disaster. And I think that would actually be very difficult. Government can proceed, they can announce that, but I think quite a number of organizations will be able to very convincingly challenge it in court.
So my understanding of how declaring a state of disaster might help is that they would be able to speed up procurement of the resources that they need, that they would be able to cut through the red tape, get the parts, for example, that some of the power stations need, move really, really quickly on things like that. Of course, our main frame of reference for a state of disaster is what we've gone through with COVID-19. We saw a lot of new regulations being gazetted during that period, but that was obviously to do with crowd control and the movement of people, restrictions of where you could go, where you couldn't go, what you could and couldn't buy. But it was a very hands-on approach by government. And I'm wondering if that hands-on approach would then continue into a state of disaster on electricity. So, for example, does the Act allow for government to say, now that we're in a state of disaster, Eskom, you've got your plan for load shedding, we're taking this over and this is our plan? Would they have that power?
In essence, yes, because what the State of Disaster Act provides for is the issuing of regulations by the responsible minister. At this stage, we cannot say what those regulations would entail, but it can be quite far-reaching. So you have the Act on the one hand, but the Act itself does not go into any details as to precisely what can be done. That, in the final analysis, depends upon the nature of the crisis. To undertake things of the kind that you've just mentioned, I can, however, not see that government would be able to easily do that. Why not? Well, because you do need expertise. You do need the specific expertise that you would find or should be finding in Eskom. And also in the private sector. Clearly, government itself, the executive, simply does not have the expertise to take over those functions currently performed by Eskom and in the private sector. So I can't really see that that government can make a proper contribution towards addressing this issue through more critical measures that it could introduce. It simply, as far as I'm concerned, do not have the ability, the technical ability, the mechanical ability, the professionalism and so on outside Eskom and outside the private sector to actually do it.
So one of the other issues I wanted to ask you, and we certainly saw this during COVID, the army was deployed to patrol the streets to make sure that curfews were adhered to. And we have seen the army being deployed, I think, to 4 power stations here in South Africa because of the concerns around sabotage. Does a state of disaster allow the president to deploy the army more easily and in a more widespread fashion?
In essence, yes, it does. But once again, and I hope I'm still answering your question, once again, the question arises whether that is a suitable and rational thing to do. Whether the army would indeed be able to address problems of the kind of which is confronted, of which Eskom is confronted with. The latest media reports that I've read, for example, in 2 or 3 days ago in the Sunday Times, indicated that the army's deployment in at various power stations actually do not produce the necessary results, precisely because you need much more focused police and specifically detective intervention, which is the kind of intervention that the army is simply not well positioned to actually perform. The big concern at this stage, I think, and I think that is the concern of the public generally, is this. whenever you deal with a situation of a state of disaster, it gives a lot of power to government, and those powers can be abused. We know that. We know that from our experience with COVID. I think that is going to be responded to in two ways by the public. In the first instance, I think the public, especially organized public, media, civil society organizations, trade organizations, and so on and so forth, would be much more quick, much more fast in actually responding to any of those measures, precisely because it can possibly invade seriously into basic constitutional rights. And I think that's my sense, that the court would also be quite willing to actually help the public. That's the first point. And the second point is this. I think the state, especially after the 2021 uprising that we had in KZN, has proven itself to be really very inadequate to actually deal with any serious uprising, any serious public dissatisfaction. This is a very important point because I think at this stage, the South African public, in all societies basically, be it middle class societies in big towns and cities, be it in rural areas, are simply not in the mood to take invading measures hands down. I think that is clearly what we've witnessed at the moment, and I think the ability of government to actually deal with that is much more limited than it used to be.
Thank you so much for your views there, constitutional jurist Professor Koos Malan, just weighing in on the legal issues around a state of disaster. The fact that it's a man-made disaster would not actually get in the way of this being declared a state of disaster, but the government would need to show how their involvement will assist the process.